So in the previous video, we talked about graphs that kind of are affected when you have an amplitude change. Now we're going to look at period changes. So in particular, the b value. So if you have y is equal to a sine of bt, and t can be x or theta or whatever you want, and cosine bt. Basically, what we're now going to be looking at is what happens when I change. Whoops, that's wrong. What happens when you have a change in the b. Okay, so what's going to happen here when this changes? So let's start off with an example. So let's say we wanted to graph y is equal to sine of 2x. Okay, so we want to graph this. Well, the first thing to look at is that the period is not going to be 0 to 2 pi, because usually if you see in the sine function, you see that the sine function completes one full cycle starting at 0 all the way to 2 pi. Okay, now that's not going to happen because now there's going to be a 2 in front of it. When there's an x, it's going to be 0 to 2 pi. Now, what do? All we have to do to figure out the new period is going to be take 2 pi and divide it by b. So what's going to be our new period? Well, our period is going to be equal to 2 pi over b. In this case, b is going to be equal to 2. So my new period is going to be pi. So that means it's going to complete one full cycle from starting at 0 and ending at pi. Okay? Now, all we have to do is kind of think about it in fourths. So what's halfway between 0 and pi? Well, that's just going to be pi over 2. What is halfway between 0 and pi over 2? That's just going to be pi over 4. And then what is halfway between pi over 2 and pi? Okay, well, this one might be a little bit harder to look at because you might be like, okay, well, what's that going to be? Well, if you think about it in quarters, it's going to be just 3 pi over 4. Now, how can you kind of figure this out a little easier? One way that you can do is you can kind of divide. So if you wanted to look at these two, what's the halfway between those two? You can take pi over 2 plus pi and then divide it by 2. So basically finding the midpoint between those two. You'll see that you'll get 3 pi over 4. Okay, that's a really easy way to do it. So you can do it for any value. So if you wanted to do pi over 2 and 0, you can just take pi over 2 plus 0 divided by 2, finding the midpoint, and you'll see that you get pi over 4. Okay? All right, so that's the period. So the period, that's basically what it is. You have these new points, and now all you have to do is figure out what the amplitude should be. Well, there's nothing in the amplitude, so it's just going to be 1 and negative 1. Okay, and now all we have to remember is that sine starts at 0, and then just do the pattern 0, 1, 0, negative 1, 0. So the graph is going to look something like this. Whoops, I kind of messed it up. Okay, so that's kind of what it looks like. Okay, now let's do another problem. Okay, so now let's say we have y equals 3 cosine of pi, no, let's not do that one yet, of 7x. So we have something that looks like that. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to figure out what the period should be, because you see that there's period stuff and there's also amplitude stuff. Now amplitude is really easy. Amplitude is going to be 3, but we'll do that at the end. So amplitude equals 3. Now we have to figure out what the period should be. So now my period is going to be 2 pi divided by b. In this case, b is 7, so I have 2 pi over 7. Okay, so that means when I go ahead and do my graph, I'm going to start at 0 and I'm going to end at 2 pi over 7. Okay. All right, now here is where the midpoints actually will really help, because now before it was really easy to tell, and now it's not as easy. So let's try to figure out what the halfway point between 0 and 2 pi over 7 is. So we got to do 2 pi over 7 plus 0 and then divide it by 2. Okay, so I would recommend just using your calculator at this point. So I'm going to be using it. So 2 pi over 7. And then what I'm going to do is divide it by 2, and that's going to give me pi over 7. Okay, so midway between here is going to be pi over 7. Okay, so that's the first one. Now the second one, now we want to figure out what the halfway point between 0 and pi over 7 is. Okay, so if I take 0 plus pi over 7 and then divide it by 2, okay, so I'm going to take pi over 7 and then I'm going to divide it by 2, and I'm going to get pi over 14. So this guy's going to be pi over 14. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is I need to figure out the last one. Oh, let me change this. Now we want to figure out what is the midpoint between pi over 7 and 2 pi over 7. So pi over 7 plus 2 pi over 7 divided by 2. Okay, so this is going to give me 3 pi over 7 divided by 2, which is going to give me 3 pi over 14. Okay, it's going to be 3 pi over 14. Again, you can use your calculator if you'd like. Okay, so now what we got to do is, okay, now let's figure out what the amplitude should be. So now that we know what the points in the middle should be, the amplitude should be 3. Okay, so this is going to go all the way to 3. Okay, all right, so now all we have to do is just plot the points. So now that since we're looking at cosine, cosine starts at 1. So now it's going to start at 3. So it's going to be 3, 0, negative 3, 0, 3. So the graph is going to look something like this. Okay, so that's what that graph looks like. Okay, all right, now let's do one more problem. Okay, so let's say we wanted to do y is equal to negative 2. Let's just do negative 2 sine of pi, whoops, where did it go? Pi theta. Okay. Okay, so notice that we have a couple things. We have a period of change, okay? So the period is going to change. So change in period. We also have amplitude. And we also have a flip of the graph, okay? So we have 3 different things that we have to do. So let's start off with the period. I think starting with the inside is always the easier. It's always, let's work with the hard part first. Well, we do know that the amplitude is 2, and then we also have to do a flip. Now the period here is going to be 2 pi over b. In this case, what is b? Well, b is going to be this pi that's in front of this x, which in this case is a theta. It's going to be 2 pi over pi, which in this case is going to give me 2. Okay, so that means when I do my graph, it's going to start from 0, and it's going to end at 2 radians. Okay, this actually is a little easier because what's halfway between 2? That's just 1. Halfway between this is just 1/2. Halfway between this is just going to be 1 1/2, or 3 over 2, or whatever you want to call it. I'm just going to write 3 over 2. Okay, or 1.5 if you want to do decimals. Okay, now the amplitude is going to be 2. Okay, so let's go ahead and do 2. So it's going to be start at 2 up here and negative 2 down here. And then sine starts at 0. So it's going to be 0, 2, 0, negative 2, 0. Okay, now technically this would be the answer, but in this case we're forgetting one last thing. We also have to flip it. So now what we're going to do is we're going to flip this sine curve. Okay, so let me just draw this arrow. So I have 0, 1/2, 1, 3/2, 2. Okay, now I'm going to flip it. So when I flip this, it's still going to stay the same. The only thing that I'm flipping is these guys. Okay, so this is going to go down to negative 2 now. This is going to go up to 0, then negative, then positive 2, okay, then back to 0. Okay, so now it looks something like this. So now everything is all flipped. So my green graph is my answer. Okay, so just try to take these problems a little bit at a time. They're not too terrible. Obviously, if you've taken a higher level trigonometry class, there's more to it. You also have vertical shifts, you also have phase shifts, but we're not going to cover them in this class. But this is basically the gist of it. You basically saw a little bit of the gist of the trig, and now what we're going to do in the next video, we will do a little bit of calculus.